Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It is afternoon here in London, and my name is Louisa Uliet, and I'm curator of talks and events at the Photographers Gallery. We're delighted to be here with Laurel Chor. Laurel is a photojournalist and a conservationist. She has documented the Rohingya refugee crisis, the tsunami in Indonesia in 2018, and more recently, the protests in Hong Kong, where she is joining us now from. Today, we will look at her practice and examine the importance and power of images, looking at themes like the freedom of the press, the role of social media and virility in shaping the narrative around social justice movements, and the wider context of working as a photojournalist in a time of protest. Laurel will be in conversation with En Liang Khong, and is a writer and editor whose work has been featured in publications like Freeze and Art Review. At the end of last year, he wrote a feature for the Financial Times on viral culture and the Hong Kong protest, which is accessible online. I'll put a link in the chat later. After the discussion, we will move to questions and comments from you. The event should last roughly 1 hour. Please note, we are recording this, so if you do not wish to be featured, please turn off your camera. There will be time after Laurel and En's discussion for you to comment or ask questions using either the chat feature here or the Zoom function that allows you to raise your hand electronically. We will unmute you so you can speak. We are approaching this event in the same way we do all of our public programs, which is with the aim of creating a forum of trust and mutual respect, so please keep that in mind. I hope today's discussion inspires you, and we look forward to seeing you again here during some of our other planned online activity, and even more hopefully in the gallery again soon, which reopened last week. Thank you again for joining us, and now to Laurel Chor and En Liang Khong. Thank you.
Thank you. So I thought what would be helpful first would be to maybe talk a bit through our relationship to working with Hong Kong, working on the through the protest movements, through whether it's writing and taking photographs, kind of what really drew us to it as a subject to cover. So I've worked as I started out as a journalist on the human rights platform Open Democracy, and later I've been an editor and writer at arts magazines, Freeze and currently Art Review. And so I guess covering Hong Kong since 2014 through all those outlets, I've moved from interviewing, talking to leaders and activists and embedded in the social movements, and then looking much more at artists and the culture produced through the social movement, so placards and songs, graffiti, and I suppose what's really drawn me away from looking at the culture, looking at the discourse of high politics, is this really distinctive political art and visual cultural protest that's emerged in Hong Kong in recent years, and obviously all cultures have their all protests have their own very strong visual cultures. So you can see that in the Gilets Jaunes movement in France, or the rough placards produced through Occupy Wall Street. But there's something about this aesthetic that's emerged in Hong Kong that would be really great to unpack through this talk. So Laurel, I wondered whether you could tell us a bit about how you've come to cover the protest through your work.
First of all, thanks everyone for joining. It's a pleasure to be here. I am from Hong Kong. I'm based in Hong Kong. I've been working here as a journalist for about 6 years now. I used to be like an online editor. I was a video producer. And then about 1.5 years ago, I went freelance as a photojournalist. And I only went freelance about just a few months before the protests broke out. And I was grateful that I had the freedom to be able to cover that story very intensely, kind of on my own terms. Because if I had been working, for example, at my previous job at Vice, where I was covering all of Asia, I really wouldn't have been able to dedicate all that time to it and to tell that story with such detail from day to day. So, and then, no one really predicted that the protests could have, turned out the way that they did. And for me as a Hong Konger, it was really a very intense experience to witness all of that and to document it. So I'm glad that I'm able to share some of that today. Yeah, it was a very emotionally, physically, professionally intense time, and this whole year has been a lot, and it sort of culminated with the national security law just the last month. So it's a tough time for Hong Kong, as it is for many places right now.
Yeah, I wondered actually whether skipping ahead, because I think people will be interested in the implications of that security law. Whether you could tell us a bit about, just some background. This is a new law that came into effect this year that radically reduces autonomy and the ability to protest in the city, and it criminalizes secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion. And obviously critics are very concerned that about the implications for freedom of speech. And as an editor, I've noticed it's become increasingly hard to commission work around politics and dissent, political dissent in Hong Kong, and people are obviously quite understandably very, very wary about their name being out there. So a lot more requests to anonymize work, and I wondered, whether you could tell us a bit about whether it's impacted you and what people are thinking about it.
Yeah, maybe if Louisa, you could start the slideshow and can start talking about that and how things have changed. I mean, I think what's interesting for me is now when I talk about the work that I didn't make that long ago. These images are from less than a year ago. This one, for example, is from I think October, November. You wouldn't be able to see scenes like this anymore. Things, even a few months before these scenes, you would have never been able to imagine that they could happen, and now it would be impossible. And the national security law is definitely one of the biggest reasons. So, the national security law, like you said, essentially criminalizes dissent, and now people are getting arrested just for having banners on them. So, let alone being able to come out and participate in these huge protests. So it's sad for me to see some of these images now and to realize that we might never see events like this again. Even the protests, I don't think the police have given, because in Hong Kong, the police have to give authorization for gatherings. I don't think we haven't seen that permission from the police since I think August last year. And now with the national security law, the government sort of has carte blanche to make anything illegal, really. Like people are now doing, Hong Kong people, like as you've written about, people are very creative. They find new ways to resist, and people are doing things like holding up blank pieces of paper. But even that's being targeted.
Yeah, I do, because there's actually a great essay written by the political scientist Sebastian Veig, and he wrote it in the years following the initial 2014 protests, where he basically described the protest movement as legalistic and utopian. So the triggers for these social movements that we've seen in Hong Kong have been very sort of legalistic in terms of how they've been fired off, and in a way the demands that are being made. So in 2014, it was an anger around lack of public electoral participation, and in many ways the movement around it was sort of invested in trying to negotiate around that with the government appearing. We have student leaders appearing on television with government officials, that kind of thing. And and similarly, with 2019, again, a sort of legalistic impetus into how it was fired off. But at the same time, you have these really intense visual culture that's emerged. It's quite incredible. I remember visiting in 2014 for the first time, and this is already towards the tail end of the protests, where I think the government had followed a sort of rather clever line of letting it basically die out, and reducing sort of popular support for the protesters in the city. So really at this kind of quite protracted stalemate that that activists reached at the end of that year. And so, but by the same time, it's the center of the city, the financial district, is completely covered in umbrellas and tents and huge towering kind of folk art. And so there's this I've always sort of felt, and of course that's not to say that that this new law is very serious, of course, but there's always been that intense creativity that's accompanied the process, and that's allowed it, as it's been so integral, right, to the to how it's maintained itself through capturing those places in international news media.
It is quite interesting as I think as a photographer, as a visual storyteller, to photograph something that sort of has a very strong visual signature of its own that is now globally recognizable almost instantly. The yellow helmet, the Post-its, the umbrellas, and what Hong Kong looks like in itself. Hong Kong already was so photogenic and recognizable. So it's on one hand, it makes it easy to photograph because it is so visual. But on the other hand, it is challenging to be able to tell different stories, to find a way as a photographer to not lean on those visual tropes in a way. And then in the visual stuff, it goes beyond, photo and video. Like, of course, this protest is very much online. There's a lot of social media behind the scenes. There's a lot of organizing on Telegram groups and all that. And on Instagram, there's a lot of accounts now that post things about this. And, even, not just the design of the posts and all that, but also even like the use of emojis, the use of stickers. It's almost its own language in a way. So it is a very visual movement, and which has, in a way, it makes it, it's an important story, and it makes it even easier to tell, for sure. And the protesters knew that. I think that's what, look at this photo, like #ThankYouWorld with a QR code. That was designed to be photographed, that was designed to be seen by the international media, and that's exactly what they wanted. They knew to stand by the skyline in this photo. They knew to have this event by the waterfront. They're very aware of what things look like. And I don't really know where that comes from. I mean, you can probably talk more about that, like, I think it's just so, like, this collective savviness of here, like at these events, like when it rains, everyone has an umbrella ready. And the moment it rains, they're ready to, or even when it's sunny, they'll have them out because they know they know it looks good, and they know that's so photographable, and they know that's a symbol. And this savviness, it's also interesting because, obviously they can tell you're a photographer, and they sort of play off of that too. They know people are watching. So
it's interesting that they're prepared to do that.
Sorry?
It's interesting that they're very attuned to, I suppose, that that online image and how it can be represented.
I think Hong Kong is very online too. Like most cities and societies, but I think we're like especially online. everyone has their face in their phones all the time, and we have really fast internet. So, you know, people are like watching things on the train to work, and I think that probably has contributed to people just know how to make things go viral, and because I think also the youth leading this movement, they're just very extra savvy too.
Yeah, that's the one thing that I was really struck by. I was trying to figure out why there was this to some of the sort of cultural products produced by the protesters, why there was this kind of like graphic polish to it, and obviously so many of these things are shared at you know, a huge rate over these Telegram groups, just all the time when I was there. And also really, really funny as well. So I think the thing that really struck me, I suppose, was from covering it 5-6 years ago, where I suppose the emphasis there was, or at least it seemed to me in terms of how it looked visually, that there was, you know, monumental artworks, a huge umbrella man, these actually, you know, really time-intensive folk sculptures being produced on the streets. And as some of you may know, obviously with the intensity of the police crackdown and violence and how that impacted the protest movement last year, you know, the movement has taken on a much more fluid approach, both to you know, how it functions as a movement on the streets, and also in the culture that it produces. So I think it comes down to this, you know, what you're talking about, this this mass interest in how things go viral. So one of the much talked about things, and you know, I noticed it everywhere, was this this revolutionary anthem, Glory to Hong Kong, was produced. I think it originally emerged on a Reddit like forum, and then, you know, was heard everywhere, from sort of football stadiums to shopping malls. And it's funny because, you know, it functions like a meme, or it functions like something going viral, right? And adapting to you know, different contexts, and slipping back into the online world as well. I think there was a YouTube video that went viral last year where this entire orchestra dressed in helmets and balaclavas were playing this full blast, and then you know, doing it with a sort of cinematic cloud of smoke over them as well.
Yeah, that video, and it's like super high production value, like
right.
that. I don't even know how they would have done that secretly. Like, it's beautifully done. It's super professional. I think part of what my theory, you know, like part of what made the movement so long lasting in a way, how it was able to gain all that momentum and involve so many people, I think there's this attitude where everyone wants to do their part, no matter how small, if you are a part of the movement, you know, whether it's, you know, writing one post-it and contributing that to a Lenin wall, or like writing a whole anthem, you know, composing an anthem, or like designing a poster. You know, everyone, there's like, it's like not, and all of it's anonymous, right? It's like there's very little ego, I think, you know, people.
Right.
And the art pops up so quickly, you know, I remember, you know, like when there was this really tragic incident just over a year ago, when, you know, it was the first, protesters see it as the first death associated with the movement. A protester was protesting on the roof of a mall, and unfortunately he fell to his death. And by that night, like just within hours, there was beautiful artwork already calling, you know, for people to come out to commemorate his life, and it happened so quickly. You never know who did it. So people, you know, are willing to just sit down and put in the work and never get credit for it. And that's, I think, they feel like that's their contribution.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that the composer behind that anthem is still anonymous, I think, and obviously for safety reasons. But also, yes, there was this feeling that that people are producing, and if you look at the graphics being shared over forums and Telegram, again, that sense of anonymity. But I wanted actually, we sort of touched on it. I suppose how the movement's changed so much over the years, and especially with last year's violence. And as a photojournalist covering it, how have you had to change your, I guess, your process as well, and your your and the difficulty, I suppose, of capturing those images.
Yeah, I mean, so last year, there was so much violence. It was very physical. It was all the time, it was every weekend. It was very full on. And then I think the aim really was to just document, just to be out there witnessing and trying to capture what you can, despite the challenges, despite the heat, the tear gas, the rubber bullets. And you were just constantly just trying to catch up. And now, with there haven't really, there's been a few big protests, but for the most part, 2020, has not seen violence or protests anywhere near to the same scale as the second half of last year. And so it's definitely more challenging to tell that story visually because less is happening, especially with COVID. Nothing was happening for a while, even though resistance continues. So now, and also there's also the challenge of how do you keep the story interesting in the international consciousness when so much was going, COVID. How do you compete with that? And what's happening in the US? There's just very little oxygen in the room for a story that's been dragging on for so long. So now I'm trying to take, and this is a challenge for me as a photographer too, is to sort of take a step back and figure out ways to tell the story that's more conceptual, that's more that isn't just newsy, isn't just documentary. So the project I'm working on right now is one thing I'm doing is I'm asking Hong Kongers where they feel the most connected to Hong Kong, and I'm taking portraits of them there. Hopefully I'll be able to share those images soon. But things like that, where it's more about identity, it's more about how do I convey this sense of loss, this sense of nostalgia in a way, this sense of defeat, I think, for many in the movement. So that's my challenge. And I'm still working on that. So last year, probably my first foray into more conceptual storytelling for the story was this series of images I'd made from inside Polytechnic University, where there was a siege, where it's taken over by university students and protesters, and the police laid siege on the university, and they were in there. Gosh, I forget how long it dragged on for, but weeks. And these images are from there. The initial week was really, really intense, initial few days. And I slept inside for about a week. And, by day 6, you're kind of getting cabin feverish and nothing's really going on. And you're just walking around in this campus in circles, wearing the same clothes you've been wearing for 5 days. So, like what, I didn't know how to tell that story. We just kind of on standby. And I came across this section of campus where there are just all these abandoned bags strewn about. And I just trying to figure out what happened. And my theory is that, so it's these images. My theory is that, well, a lot of protesters actually escaped or tried to escape. And while trying to escape, they don't want to be held back by their stuff, and they don't want to have anything incriminating on them if they were caught. So they just sort of left everything behind and probably made a break for it from this area of campus, because it was sort of no man's land where protesters weren't really hanging out, but the police didn't enter. And I just started, looking through the bags, just like out of curiosity and trying to figure out what's in them. And if you go to the image before, that was where I got one more back. This one. I was looking through, at that time I was actually doing Instagram stories for Vice, and I was just sort of like anatomy of a protester's bag, and you know, like pulling stuff out. It's like standard, like black t-shirt, mask, gas mask, gloves, you know, standard stuff. And then I started finding things that you know, showed more personality, like Batman, AirPods, and but what really got me was that little purple thing below the Batman AirPods. It's like a Chinese good luck charm.
Mm.
And you know, I've spent so much time with the protesters, but you never see their faces, of course, because they're always masked. They probably never see my face because you're always in a mask. It's completely anonymous, and you don't talk in the heat of when you're all geared up. And during the siege, like everyone was just like hanging out, waiting, you know, like we're all in like flip-flops and like pajamas walking around. So it was a very surreal, for many reasons, but one of which was just seeing them as what they were, which for the most part were kids. And when I opened this bag and saw its contents and got to that good luck charm, that I kind of broke down, because that's just exactly the sort of thing that my mom would give me as a good luck charm, you know, this like traditional Chinese mom thing where they'd be like, take this and keep it in your bag, and you have no idea what it means, but you do it. And so just, you know, I kind of thought like this kid, maybe their mom gave it to them, and their mom's probably really worried about them. And I wonder if they got arrested. I wonder if they got out okay, or, you know, what happened to them. And then I started, you know, laying out all the contents on the ground, just on campus, and taking photographs of what was inside. And a lot of it you can, you know, withstand it, but then, you know, some, like I think 2 in front, the next one maybe, or the one after, you know, there's like lip gloss and like candy and like girly things. And it's just, yeah, that one, it was really jarring. And it reminded, you know, these kids, they've become so visually iconic through their gear that it is kind of dehumanizing in a way. You know, they've become this icon rather than individuals. And this was an opportunity to tell the story of who they are as individuals, even though they weren't there.
Yeah, I love the photograph of the charm, actually, because it's, I mean, one of the most distinctive things about how the protests have played out across the city is obviously the one thing that we've talked about is that they're really hyper, you know, technologically literate, and the, you know, but at the same time, the kind of older things creeping in. So sometimes get sort of shrines at subway stations. And religion, you know, I think they played kind of an interesting part in the 2014 process as well. But I love, you know, this is I suppose, you know, I'm kind of interested in how you know, you felt that challenge, you know, with a kind of, I suppose that the protests invite a kind of frenzied sort of photojournalism, with these, you know, huge, flashy, very violent imagery. And that's a sort of remarkable way of, I guess, trying to counter that narrative in some ways. And I wondered whether, you know, are there particular influences on your photojournalism that you look to for that kind of more sort of conceptual, quieter ways of covering kind of political, high intensity political events?
Well, I think for me, it was really challenging to even really think about making that shift. I think, you know, I really am a journalist first. I never considered myself an artist really, but to learn how to tell a story that's not just witnessing something or documenting something was hard. I took a workshop with Matt Black, really like in the middle of the protests, the Magnum photographer. And I think that really helped me, you know, his work, you know, it's really about capturing he's done a lot of work about, America and like middle America especially, and capturing this feeling and telling the story of this place that's really just like more of a mood, and things that he like finds on the side of the road. And so that was taking that workshop and learning from him and seeing his work was kind of the beginning of a breakthrough, I would say. And I think, for me, I don't know if I would have been able to make that shift if it weren't such a personal story. I think for me, telling this story, especially like on social media, on Instagram, where I am talking directly to whatever audience, what I wanted to convey was what it's like to see all this happen in your own home, and what it feels like, and trying to, like, I really just wanted to grab people by the shoulders and be like, this is not just a headline, like this is happening to us here. And so I think, and learning to convey that emotion and that feeling was probably what led me to try to make this shift, and the work of, my friend Hannah Reyes-Morales, where, like I said to her the other day, like her heart is like her superpower. Like her work is all about intimacy and creating safe spaces and love. And she does such a beautiful job of capturing that. And her voice is really strong in that way. So peers like Hannah and Matt Black, and also, there's so many amazing Hong Kong photographers who are covering this, and it's always, I think we all follow each other just to see how we're all telling this story, and just as a community. So I'm still learning, I'm still figuring this out, how to tell the story in a new way. But yeah.
I wonder whether you can tell us a bit about, there's a particular photograph in this slideshow of an elderly woman sort of remonstrating with police officers in full riot gear. And I just, I sort of instinctively just recognized this photograph from seeing it used in so many news stories online. I'm sure lots of the people here will recognize it too, but it's kind of an amazing shot, and I just wonder whether you could tell us a bit about the story behind it and how you captured it.
Yeah, this photo. I mean, it was actually almost exactly a year ago, because this protest was a week after. So exactly a year ago, yesterday, there was an attack by these like masked thugs wearing white t-shirts. They came out with like knives and sticks and attacked people on the subway, commuters, protesters, and it was very violent. There were like, I think dozens, if not hundreds, of these men just beating people on the train, and the police didn't do anything. And in fact, there has been evidence that the police were aware of this happening, were nearby, and didn't do anything, and sort of let the attack happen, and even interacted with the attackers, and no one's been arrested to this day. So there's a lot of anger about that incident. And so this protest happened exactly a week after that in response to that. At this point, the police, I was sort of at the tail end of the march, and the police were advancing, and I just see this woman screaming at them. And I think I probably took this picture walking backwards, trying to get out of the way of the advancing police. And the police didn't really know what to do with her, and they just sort of swallowed her into their ranks. And that was the last I saw her. And then the next day, another journalist, Isabella Steger of Quartz, she tweeted a video of her actually yelling at the protesters, telling them to go home. Basically, she, tell them to go home. She didn't want them getting hurt. Just go home, just leave.
Mm.
And I quote tweeted that and tweeted this photo. I was like, well, I saw her yelling at the police. And that tweet sort of went viral. So it was really wild to just see this image take on a life of its own. And it was humbling to realize that you can make an image that can be seen by so many and really become bigger than yourself. But another interesting lesson from that was a lot of people accused me of lying with this photo. The video of her yelling at protesters actually sort of became like a anti-protest video. People are saying, people don't want the protesters there.
Right.
I don't think that really tells the story. I think, I know she was angry at the police. I was there, I saw her do it. But, people said I like pushed her in front of the police. People are saying it's like a perspective trick, that she's actually yelling at the police, but it looks like she's yelling at that she's actually yelling at the protesters, but it looks like she's yelling at the police, that I photoshopped it. So it made me realize that also, like, people will see what they want to see. So that was a bit disheartening in a way too.
Is that something that you've had to deal with quite a bit in covering these protests? Because obviously there's intense sort of furious debate and doctored images that get shared a lot on forums, and especially around this movement. I wondered whether it's been an issue.
I mean, fake news. We are in the era of fake news, potentially even influencing presidential elections, right? So it's been interesting and very frustrating to see how much misinformation there is out there. And as a photographer, it is also interesting to realize how your images can be used in any way sometimes. Like I took one photo, I think there were several photos of this, but it was I think also the same day, but it was a police officer brandishing a baton, and I didn't even notice this detail, but this photo got used in another article, and they were saying that the police officer had put an illegal piece, add an illegal piece to the baton that basically just hurts people more, like a piece of metal. I don't know if that was it. It really could have been anything. Or there's another incident. I was actually with, another photographer. And so what happens in Hong Kong during the protests is you'll often just get an airdropped image on your phone. If you're near a protest area, people are just sharing stuff to whoever has their airdrops open. And we were standing on the train, I think getting from one protest to another, and he gets his own photograph airdropped to him, I think from the same day. And it was I believe it was a protester who had a BB gun in his pocket. I think that's what it was. And people were saying it was a real gun, or maybe it was a police officer. I'll have to look that up. But, it was really weird for him to get airdropped his own photo from the same day, with his photo basically being used as propaganda. So it's, and after this photo went viral, I met John Moore, the Getty photographer, who took one of the most iconic images in recent years of the young. So it's at the U.S.-Mexican border, and it's a young girl, a toddler, crying up at her mom as she's being searched by border officers. And that photograph really took on a life of its own. And I spoke to him, asking how he dealt with that. And he said, as a photojournalist, you just sort of have to do your best to make sure your caption's accurate and, do your job as ethically as you can. And then after that, it's kind of out of your hands. The fake news stuff too is very hard to deal with as a journalist. A lot of people accusing you of lying and stuff.
I'm interested in those ethical sort of pits that that suddenly opened up, because I remember with the 2014 protests, what really struck me sort of entering the camp was just how young the protesters were. It's just it's not something you could ever imagine happening here, but there were sort of 12-year-olds just wandering around on their own, because it's just completely politicized that generation. And just it comes back to that interesting thing you mentioned, that you were currently working on this, I suppose a sort of quieter project around identity, and one of the things that I was quite interested in is how, obviously, so the 2014 protest was this frenzied media moment in a way, really captured headlines. And then in the years following that, obviously there was a lot of depression, despondency among the movement on trying to address how it had failed. But at the same time, there was this, interesting crisis brewing within Hong Kong identity itself. Because I remember visiting in those years following the initial 2014 protests, I remember visiting Professor Chan Kin Man, who was an activist leader in 2014. I suppose then the movement actually, in a way, had its figureheads, unlike last year. And he was talking to me about research among young people in Hong Kong who just who really want to resist the idea of Chineseness, who feel really strong bonds to the idea of the locality and to Hong Kong. And I wonder whether that's something that's emerged in your in how you've had to cover things as well. Whether you can sense that there's that changing attachment to the city among protesters, as they quite rightly think that it's slipping away. And obviously the 2047 date looms ever larger, and you'll be seeing sort of gradual encroachments on rights and liberties in the city. So I wonder whether that's identity, I suppose, has been this big strand in covering the protest.
Yeah. So one I'd say the latest protest slogan that popped up on July 1st is, I guess the best translation would be like, I really freaking love Hong Kong. We really freaking love Hong Kong. And that, that's really sums it up. Like, people keep coming out because they just love this place. And with, this project I'm working on, that's what I'm trying to capture, the sense of love for this place and what it means. And I've been asking every one of them what it means for you what does it mean to you to be a Hong Konger? And I think one shift there has been probably, in recent years since the 2014 protests, is this sense that being a Hong Konger is a set of shared values. Because, Hong Kong, even though we have our own culture, we have our own history, we have our own language, like, we are still, at least ethnically, Chinese, right? This is a Chinese city, and people seem to be finding a new way to define what it means to be a Hong Konger. And there's, now there's a small number of not ethnically Chinese activists, and they've been fully accepted by the movement. So I think one of the next stories I would like to explore is actually how this new way to define what a Hong Konger is actually allowing a lot of ethnic minorities in Hong Kong to feel accepted for the first time. Because Hong Kong has a very large population of South Asian people who have been here for generations, and they speak Chinese, they were born here, they're from Hong Kong, but they probably have never really been accepted as real Hong Kongers because they're not ethnically Chinese. And I think with this movement, they are feeling accepted. If that's there's a political caveat there. If you agree with them, they'll accept you. But yeah, I think this identity question is really interesting, especially younger people. If you're born, post-colonial times and have never really felt any affinity with mainland China, for years we have definitely seen this I think, well, now it's the PORI, the Public Opinion Research Institute. They have for several years now polled people on what they identify as, and every year the number of people identified as Chinese becomes lower, and the number of people identified as Hong Kongers first increases, and now people are definitely talking more about like shared values about freedom and rule of law and democracy. And that's also difficult to capture visually.
Yes, I was curious about it because I suppose I was quite struck by the absence of attention on that in the years following the initial kind of social explosion, because I suppose it's just a much harder story for Western news editors to sell to their audiences, but it was also the kind of missing story in a way, that one where I suppose the terrain of identity was gradually being reshaped, and also being reshaped by the government, sort of inadvertently, by clamping down so heavily on I suppose different kinds of literature that was advocating for sort of localist identity. But I wondered whether so actually I think we need to wrap up in a second, so just if anybody has any comments, I think they can just put it into the chat and we can maybe try and answer some of those. But I suppose my final question was really a more kind of practical one about whether whether you felt it's sort of been difficult in many ways working with or whether there are some challenges that come with working with sort of Western news editors from afar, who can't make the sort of judgment calls that you're making on the ground. And I suppose as a freelancer, the stories that you want to tell, whether it's been difficult, finding an interest in that beyond kind of that very hyper frenzied photojournalism that we're quite used to.
Yeah, I think it's definitely the Hong Kong story, the way, Western and international media covers Hong Kong. I think it's an interesting case study in how international news gets covered, because I think Hong Kong, first of all, there's a lot of media companies that are based here, at least for now. And so a lot of the the New York Times, CNN, BBC, Time, everyone has offices here or staff here. And so suddenly I think a major international news story had a lot of people covering it who, at least to some extent, had a personal stake in it, or at least a personal connection. And then Hong Kong also being the city that it is, so, that's international and is westernized. You had a lot of Hong Kongers who are able to tell this story on their own terms, like me, or Isabel Steger at Quartz, she's from here. Mary Hui at Quartz is from here. And the New York Times, we have local people. We have local people at every media outlet who don't need this like Western filter, who don't, aren't just working as fixers to help Western journalists tell this story. So I think I don't know what the effect of that is, the impact of that is, but I do think it changes the way the story is told. I think it's part of the reason maybe why it got as much media attention as it did. People are certainly more knowledgeable, very few. I mean, people were parachuting in, but you probably had fewer people parachuting in than you would a typical international news story. So, I mean, I think one challenge is also, one thing that was jarring sometimes if I'm working with people who aren't here is realizing that for them this is just another story, and they'll
prepared to move on.
Yeah, and they forget how emotionally taxing this is for me, for anyone working on the story. I think even if you're not from here, it is really emotionally taxing. And to be emailed or messaged in the middle of the protest with something about a deadline, and it's just like, screw you. Like, so I think it I don't know if that really answers your question, but there's this international, I think the Hong Kong story is unique in the way it's being told because of I think people here have a voice.
Yeah. I mean, I've been impressed by kind of sometimes, actually in a way, the sort of small media outfits that have appeared in the wake of the Hong Kong protests and even the Sunflower Movement in Taiwan. So you get kind of outfits like New Bloom and Lausanne in Hong Kong, which have been really, really good at, as opposed to just like covering the gaps that we find in some of the Western coverage, especially around, you mentioned kind of minorities and their status in the protest movement, which was in a way such a sort of, I guess, one of the pitfalls of the original protest movement for perhaps not paying enough attention to that constituency. But I'm just aware that maybe we should look at a few of the questions in the chat. There's one about the what the situation is like for photographers now of the new security law, which we chatted a little bit about at the beginning. But do you feel it's safe for journalists and the public to go out and document these protests? I guess there's a bit of element of waiting and seeing, right?
Yeah, I think everyone is worried. The New York Times is moving a third of its staff. There's all this talk of media outlets moving out of Hong Kong. There's people are questioning, like with slogans being banned, are we allowed to report that these slogans are being said? It's, there hasn't been an overt crackdown on the media in the wake of the national security law yet. I mean, there had been anyway, police had been targeting journalists and they still are. One thing that we saw, was it yesterday? Yesterday, police sort of kettled a bunch of us journalists at this protest in a mall and checked our press passes one by one. And if you had a valid one, then you were allowed to go to past the cordon or out of this area. And if you weren't, some journalists, from smaller outlets who the police just decided weren't real journalists, basically, they were fined for illegal assembly, 2,000 Hong Kong dollars, which is 200 pounds.
That's really worrying. It's really worrying because I suppose there's always been this interesting debate around that line between journalism and activism, whether sort of journalists can be activists, and the way they suppose there is a whatever your kind of take on it, there's definitely a kind of grey line in between sometimes, kind of an ethical duty that you have as a journalist that can bleed into that kind of thing. So I guess this is a real threat to it. There's another good question actually. Says, is there a place or context where you'd like your work shown that it hasn't yet been shown?
I mean, I haven't really shown my work. It gets published in outlets, but I haven't had exhibits or anything really. I guess. I
mean, the gallery is quite a strange space for this work. I suppose that's sort of struck me quite a bit, looking at, I suppose, how artists have struggled with dealing with the protest movement. Some have sort of carried on in that traditional sense of producing these sort of polished high art that gets shown in commercial galleries, whereas others are actually, much more would rather, stay quiet and like you said, there's this impulse among many people who are activists or involved in the movement to put that first and to be anonymous. In a way, because it sort of serves the purposes of the movement rather than being seen to exploit it in any sense.
Yeah, I think, again, like you said, we're still figuring out what we can do and how much space there is. I'm still just gonna keep doing what I'm doing until I'm told otherwise, I guess. I guess in terms of audiences I would like to reach is, for months now, we've been talking about how there's so many parallels, at least even just visual parallels, between what's happening in the US and Hong Kong. People are holding up umbrellas and makeshift shields against tear gas, and it's like it's crazy. It's like deja vu, and just it'd be nice to open that dialogue and figure out, you know, there's so many parallels in what's going on around the world, and I wish there was more mutual dialogue and just, you know, opening up that conversation. And that's something I'd like to do as a storyteller.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I suppose that's what I found most heartening about sort of looking at the movement. It's the ways in which it has been able to demonstrate that kind of internationalism. So I remember there was this artwork in 2014 by the Add Oil Collective. They projected messages of support for the movement on top of the, I think it was the government headquarters, and just thousands and thousands of messages from across the world and Gaza, and sort of linking ideas of social justice to, you know, what was going on in America, of course. So I suppose that it was that kind of that spirit that I've really sort of seen take off in Hong Kong, and seen it in the kind of media that's been produced as well. Right, so I think we sadly have to leave it there. But thanks so much, Laurel.
Thank you. Thank you for this discussion, and thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you, everyone. Well done today. Thanks for that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. If you have a moment, we have a quick poll just to get your feedback of what you've enjoyed about this afternoon, and other, sorry, I'm reading, but trying to think on my feet too. So if you have a moment, if you could just complete this poll, just so we get a sense of how you enjoyed this afternoon's talk, and hopefully we'll see you again at the gallery at some point soon. Thank you so much, Laurel, for such lovely insights into a really hard situation. And thank you also for your thoughtful observations and questions. And lastly, thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
I'm launching the poll now.